They called her the fat girl in the cabin. They laughed when she walked through town. They placed bets on whether she'd survive another winter alone. But on one frozen morning in 1879, a hard-eyed rancher knocked on her door. Not to mock her, not to pity her, but because he needed something only she could give. What happened next would silence every cruel voice in Blackthorn Crossing. Rosalie Whittaker didn't just find a place at someone's table. She built one of her own. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The cold that settled over Blackthorn Crossing in the winter of 1879 was the kind that didn't announce itself. It didn't howl or rage the way storms sometimes did, rolling in off the plains with enough warning to send people scrambling for their shutters. This cold arrived quietly, like a debt collector who already knew you couldn't pay. It crept under doors and through the spaces between log walls, found the hollow places in a body, and settled there. Rosalie Whittaker felt it in her knees first, the way she always did. She'd been kneeling on the kitchen floor since before first light, feeding wood into the iron stove with fingers that hadn't quite warmed up yet from the night before. The fire took slow. She'd been rationing the dry wood since the second week of December. Mixing it with the wetter logs, she'd split herself from a fallen elm along the creek, and the wet wood smoked more than it burned. The cabin filled with a thin haze that stung her eyes and made the already dim morning feel dimmer. She didn't complain about it. There was no one to complain to. The cabin was small, one room essentially, with a curtained-off sleeping corner and a root cellar beneath a trapdoor in the floor. She'd lived here for 11 years since her father passed and left her the property with considerably more debt than he'd ever let on. The debt was long settled, paid off through years of careful living and the steady work of her hands, but the cabin remained small. She hadn't seen any reason to expand it. A bigger space would only have made the silence more noticeable. She got the fire going properly around the time the sky outside began shifting from black to the particular shade of gray-purple that passed for dawn in December. By then, she'd already mixed her first dough. A simple rye loaf, heavy and honest, the kind that kept well in cold weather. She had 4 more loaves to bake before she'd load up the hand-pulled cart and make her way into town. Tuesday was her delivery day. The Hendersons at the dry goods store took 2 loaves every week, without fail. Old Morris at the livery liked her cornbread, though he only admitted it when no one else was around. The school teacher, a nervous young woman from Ohio named Miss Pratt, had started ordering a small pie every 2 weeks. Apple when Rosalie could get the fruit, pear when she couldn't. It wasn't much. It was enough. Rosalie stood at the counter and worked the dough with the heels of her hands, pushing and folding in the rhythm she'd learned from her mother so many years ago that the motion lived somewhere below conscious thought now, in her shoulders and wrists. She was 31 years old. She was not a small woman. She'd never been small, not even as a child, and the years of baking and eating what she baked hadn't changed that fact. She had thick arms, capable hands, a round face that turned red in the cold and stayed red for a while after she came inside. Her hair was dark brown, almost black, and she wore it braided and pinned up because loose hair and baking didn't mix. She was not, by the standards that Blackthorn Crossing applied to women, what anyone would call pretty. She knew this. She'd known it since she was about 7 years old, when Thomas Deere had announced it loudly during a school spelling competition, and the teacher hadn't corrected him. She folded the dough and pressed it into the pan and told herself, as she did most mornings, that it was a fine day to be alive. By the time she'd loaded her cart and started down the path toward the main road, the sky had gone fully pale and the temperature had dropped another few degrees. Her breath came out in short white bursts. The cart wheels crunched on the frozen ground. She kept her head down against the wind. The road into Blackthorn Crossing ran about 1.5 miles, cutting between bare-limbed cottonwoods and the occasional frozen cattle pond. She passed the Brannigan place. The Brannigans had 8 children and a hound dog named Fletcher, who came out to bark at her every single Tuesday without ever recognizing her, which she found both insulting and a little bit funny. She passed the old mill that hadn't run since the flood in '74. She passed the spot where somebody had nailed a crudely painted sign to a post that read, Blackthorn Crossing, population 340 and holding, the last part added in smaller, more bitter letters than the first. She'd been born here. She'd grown up here. She would probably die here. The thought didn't fill her with dread the way it once had. It just sat there, flat and factual, like the landscape around it. She was halfway into town when she heard it. The sound of hooves, moving deliberately, and then the sound of a horse being pulled up short behind her. She stepped to the side of the road out of reflex and turned. The man on the horse was perhaps 40, maybe a few years past it, with the kind of face that weather carves rather than ages. Deep lines around the eyes, skin the color of tanned leather, jaw set in a permanent expression somewhere between concentration and irritation. He wore a coat that had once been good quality and was now just warm. His horse was a big gray gelding, well-fed and sure-footed, which told Rosalie more about the man than his coat did. He looked at her cart. He looked at the wrapped loaves in it. Then he looked at her. "Those baked goods?" he said. "Yes, sir." "You make them yourself?" "I do." He dismounted in the unhurried way of a man who'd done it 10,000 times, tied the horse to a nearby branch with a single loop that somehow seemed sufficient, and walked over to the cart. He pulled back the cloth covering without asking permission, which she noted but didn't remark on. He picked up one of the rye loaves, turned it over in his hands, smelled it. "How much?" "That one's spoken for," Rosalie said. "I have another one that's free." He put the first loaf down and she pointed to the second. He picked it up, tore a small piece from one end, again without asking, chewed it slowly, and stood there for a moment with his eyes slightly unfocused, like a man doing arithmetic in his head. "Where do you live, Us?" he said. Rosalie paused. It was an unusual question. "Up the road about 1.5 miles," she said carefully. "The cabin on the east side, past the cottonwoods. I know the place." He looked at her again, direct and appraising in a way that didn't feel insulting exactly, but didn't feel comfortable either. "I'm Thaddeus Boone, Boone Ridge Ranch, 9 miles north." She knew the name. Everyone in Blackthorn Crossing knew the name. Boone Ridge was the largest cattle operation within 50 miles, or had been before the hard winters of the past decade had thinned the herds and thinned the men who worked them. Thaddeus Boone had a reputation as a fair employer who paid on time and expected full value for it, and as a man who didn't engage in the social life of the town if he could help it. She'd seen him perhaps twice before, at a distance, at the feed store, and once at the land office. "Rosalie Whitaker," she said. He nodded, like he was filing that away. "I need a cook. Permanent position at the ranch. Board included, private quarters off the main house kitchen. I've got 14 men and I've been feeding them salt pork and hardtack for 3 weeks since my last cook quit to get married." He said the last part with the faint disgust of a man who considered marriage a poor reason to abandon a job. "I'll pay $12 a month and your supplies." Rosalie stood very still on the frozen road. $12 a month was more than she cleared in a good month with her baking. Board included meant no wood to ration and no mornings on her knees coaxing fire out of wet logs. Private quarters meant a room she didn't have to share. She opened her mouth. And then she thought about 14 men. She thought about what 14 men would see when they looked at her. She thought about what they would say to each other and eventually to her face. And she thought about what it would be like to have to cook and serve and smile through all of it, day after day, in a place where she had no way to leave at the end of the day and close a door between herself and them. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Boone," she said slowly, "but I should be honest with you. I'm not—" She stopped, tried again. "No man ever chooses a woman like me, sir. Not for anything that involves people watching. Your men would have opinions about it." Thaddeus Boone looked at her for a long moment. His expression didn't change much, but something behind his eyes shifted slightly. "My men," he said, "have opinions about everything. I don't manage a ranch based on the opinions of cowboys." He paused. "I'm not looking for someone to be pleasant to look at, Miss Whitaker. I'm looking for someone who can make 14 exhausted, cold, ill-tempered men feel like they've got something worth coming in from the cold for. That bread," he held up the piece he'd taken, "does something. You either have that or you don't." He said it the way he might describe a quality in a horse. Matter of fact. Unapologetic. Rosalie stared at him. "I can cook," she said, because it was the truest thing she knew about herself. "I know you can." He tore another small piece from the loaf. $8 now, 4 at the end of the month. That's how I do first month with new hire. Make sure we both want the arrangement to continue." He looked at her steadily. "You interested?" She had expected pity or condescension or some variant of the expression men wore when they were doing what they considered a kindness to someone they considered beneath them. She had not expected this. A man who spoke to her as though he were making a business arrangement with another adult, neither embarrassed by the conversation nor trying to be kind about it, just direct. It was almost startling enough to be off-putting. "When would you need me to start?" she said. "Friday," he said. "Day after tomorrow. I'll send a wagon." He folded the remaining piece of bread in his coat pocket, pressed 8 silver dollars into her hand, the exact right amount, pre-counted, which suggested he'd already decided before he'd tasted the bread, mounted his horse with the same unhurried competence with which he'd dismounted and rode back the way he'd come. Rosalie stood on the frozen road for a moment, $8 in her palm, listening to the sound of the hoofbeats fade. Then she picked up her cart handles and kept walking toward town, because the Hendersons were expecting their bread, and she still had 4 deliveries to make. But something in her chest had shifted, in the small, careful way things shifted when you'd spent years keeping everything very tightly in place, and something nudged one of the pieces. She told herself it was just the cold making her eyes water. She told Miss Pratt first, partly because she had to explain why the weekly pies would be stopping, and partly because Miss Pratt was the only person in Blackthorn Crossing who'd shown her consistent kindness without obvious motive. The teacher was in her classroom when Rosalie arrived, correcting papers at her desk, and she looked up with the slightly distracted expression of someone interrupted mid-thought. When Rosalie explained about the offer, Miss Pratt's expression went through several stages quickly. Surprise, concern, and then something cautious that she was clearly trying to keep off her face. "Boone Ridge," Miss Pratt said. "That's Rosalie, those cowboys." "I know. They're rough men. I've had some of their sons in class, and—" She stopped herself. "I don't mean to say you can't handle it. I just mean it might be difficult." "More difficult than this winter?" Rosalie said, and she didn't say it bitterly, just honestly, and Miss Pratt had the grace to look a little ashamed. "No," the teacher said quietly. "I suppose not." The hardware store owner's wife, a square-jawed woman named Dora Fenchurch, had a different reaction when Rosalie stopped in to cancel her standing order. Dora looked her up and down with the frank assessment of someone who'd never learned to pretend she wasn't doing it, and said, "Thaddeus Boone hired you as a cook? What did he do? Order her blind?" Rosalie counted out the coins for the last order she'd already delivered, and did not look up. "I believe he tasted my bread first." Dora took the coins. "Well, don't expect those cowboys to behave themselves. Men like that haven't seen a—" She paused, choosing. "Haven't been around a woman regularly in a while. They'll be a handful." "Thank you for the warning," Rosalie said, and left. She spent Thursday packing. There wasn't much. Her mother's recipe book, wrapped carefully in an old flour sack. Her 2 good aprons. A change of clothes. Her knife roll. A set of 8 knives she'd bought one by one over 7 years and kept in a condition that bordered on reverent. A jar of her mother's herb salt, which she'd been replenishing from the same recipe for a decade and thought of as a kind of continuity with something she'd lost. She looked around the cabin in the early evening, at the stove she'd fought with every morning for 11 years, at the low ceiling that made tall visitors duck, at the window that looked out on the frozen creek and the bare trees beyond it. She had been lonely here. She had also been safe here, in the particular way that being alone and unseen is a kind of safety. You can't be mocked for what people don't see. She was walking toward people who would see her every day. She blew out the lamp and lay down in the dark. She thought about what Thaddeus Boone had said, not looking for someone pleasant to look at. Make 14 men feel like they've got something worth coming in from the cold for. She'd been doing that her whole life, making things worth coming toward. She'd just never been paid for it before. The wagon arrived Friday morning while the sky was still more gray than blue. The driver was a young man, maybe 20, with sandy-colored hair and an oversized coat that he'd clearly been growing into for a few years. He gave his name as Cal. He looked at her with the frank curiosity of someone who'd been told to fetch the new cook and was now processing the information that the new cook looked like this. He didn't say anything about it. He just helped her load her things into the wagon bed and then climbed back up front and clicked at the horses. They rode 9 miles north in the thin winter cold. Cal pointed out landmarks, cuts, the creek crossing, the ridge that gave the ranch its name, a cluster of dead cottonwoods where, he said, the hands had held a shooting contest last summer and a man named Dix had put a round through his own hat. He said it without apparent embarrassment, the way young men related the legends of their workplace. The ranch appeared over a rise. Several buildings arranged around a central yard, a big barn, a bunkhouse, a main house that was larger than Rosalie had expected, built of stout timber with a covered porch running the full front. Cattle stood in a distant field, dark shapes against the white ground. Smoke came from 2 chimneys. As the wagon rolled into the yard, 3 men near the barn turned to look. Then a 4th came out of the bunkhouse door. By the time Cal pulled the horses up, there were 6 of them watching. Rosalie had braced herself for this moment during the entire 9-mile ride. She stepped down from the wagon without waiting for help, because waiting for help that wasn't offered created a particular kind of embarrassment that she'd learned to avoid. And she turned to face them. One of them, stocky, dark-bearded, maybe 35, looked at her and then looked at the man next to him with an expression that communicated a great deal without words. The second man, taller, with a face like a hatchet and a lazy quality to his posture, let a slow smile spread across his face. "Well," the tall one said, "that's the new cook." "That is," Cal said, with the slightly defensive tone of someone who'd spent 9 miles deciding whose side he was on. "She gonna cook for us or sit on us?" the dark-bearded one said, and several of the others laughed, and Rosalie felt the familiar sensation, that small internal buckling, like a wall with a crack running through it. And she looked at the man who'd said it for exactly 2 seconds. Then she picked up her knife roll from the wagon bed in her bag, and she walked toward the main house. "Kitchen," she said to Cal. "Around the side, ma'am, door there." He pointed, walking with her, and she could hear the men behind her still talking, lower now, and she didn't listen to what they were saying. The kitchen was large by any standard she'd worked in. It had a proper range, a real one, not the small iron stove she'd been wrestling with for years, with 6 burners and a warming oven above. There was a long preparation table, a deep stone sink with a hand pump, shelves that ran floor to ceiling on one wall, and a pantry through a narrow door on the right. The pantry was, as Thaddeus Boone had indicated, not well stocked. She took inventory: salt pork in abundance, flour, dried beans, some sad-looking onions, a crock of lard, coffee, cornmeal, molasses. A few jars of preserved tomatoes that someone had put up, not very well. 2 of them had gone bad. She put on her apron. She didn't know what the schedule had been before. She didn't know what these men expected. She knew what she could make with what was here, and she knew how to make it well, and she started. Thaddeus found her 40 minutes later, when she was rendering the lard and had the beans on, and was making a list of what she needed from town. He came in from the main house side through a door she hadn't noticed yet, and stood in the kitchen doorway in a way that suggested he wasn't used to waiting for permission to enter a room he owned. "Settling in?" he said. "I've been in worse kitchens," she said, which was true, though only barely. "I'll need a supply run tomorrow if you want proper meals by the weekend. I made a list." She held it out. He took it, looked it over. His expression was the same one she'd seen on the road, that flat, appraising look that wasn't unkind but wasn't warm, just present and attending. "Some of the men were out front when I arrived," she said, without looking up from her work. "I know," he said. "The dark-bearded one and the tall one." "Emmett Harrow and Jude Calloway," he said. "They say something to you?" "Nothing that needs handling," she said carefully. "I just want to know if that's going to be a daily problem, or if it'll settle down." Thaddeus was quiet for a moment. "I'll speak to them." "Please don't." She did look up then. "If you handle it for me, I'm the woman who ran to the boss. I'd rather earn my way past it." He looked at her steadily. "You sure about that?" "I've been earning my way past things my whole life, Mr. Boone. I'm used to it." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Dinner's at 6. They come in from the east pasture first, so give them 10 minutes to wash up." "Understood," she said. He left the way he'd come. She turned back to her stove. She wasn't sure if that exchange had gone well or not. She wasn't sure what well meant in this context with this man, in this unfamiliar kitchen with its unfamiliar sounds and smells. She was sure about the beans. She could make the beans right. She could make the cornbread right. She could make something worth coming in from the cold for. She started there. Dinner that first night was not a triumph. She served what she'd had to work with: beans with the salt pork, cornbread made properly with lard and eggs, boiled potatoes, coffee that she'd made strong because cold men always wanted strong coffee. It was not fancy food, but it was hot, and it was seasoned correctly, and the cornbread was the kind that held together when you picked it up and had a slightly crisp bottom from the cast iron. The men filed in and took their seats at the long table in the room off the kitchen that served as a dining hall. 14 of them. She watched from the kitchen doorway as they settled. Some of them looked at the food with the careful neutrality of men who'd been disappointed before and were managing expectations. Some of them with the open skepticism of men who'd made up their minds already. Emmett Harrow, the dark-bearded one, sat at the far end and said loudly enough to Carrie, "Let's see if the big woman can cook better than she looks." The table went quiet in the specific way tables go quiet when something has been said that everyone heard, but nobody wants to be the one to respond to. Rosalie went back into the kitchen and came out with the coffee pot and filled cups with the same steady competence with which she did everything, moving around the table without comment. She reached Emmett Harrow last and filled his cup and looked at him for exactly long enough to be clear that she'd heard him and had decided not to honor it with a response. He looked back at her. His expression shifted slightly. The beginning of uncertainty, quickly suppressed. She went back to the kitchen. Thaddeus ate at the end of the table nearest the kitchen door. She watched through the small window above the range as he served himself and ate and watched the men around him. After a few minutes, after the food had been tasted and the first cups of coffee drunk, the tone of the table changed, not dramatically, just the way a room changes when the food is right and hungry men are eating it. The volume came up a little. Someone laughed. A second cornbread was taken from the basket without ceremony. Emmett Harrow said nothing else. He did, when Rosalie was clearing the table afterward, pick up his own plate and bring it to the kitchen rather than leaving it where it sat. He didn't say anything. He just set it on the counter and walked out. It was not an apology. It was also not nothing. Rosalie washed the dishes and scrubbed the table and put the kitchen back in order, and then she sat on the stool in the corner for a while with her hands wrapped around a cup of hot coffee and her feet aching the way feet ache after a full day of standing and moving, and she looked at the dark kitchen window and the small reflection of herself in it. She'd made it through the first day. She'd made it through the first days before, in harder places, with fewer resources, alone. She could make it through the second day too, and the third. She blew out the lamp and went to her room, a small space, plain, with a cot and a chest and a window that looked north toward the ridge, and lay down with her boots still on because she was too tired to take them off, and she listened to the sounds of the ranch settling into night, the distant cattle, the horses in the barn, the creak of the bunkhouse, the wind off the ridge, low and persistent. After a while, she took her boots off. She pulled the blanket up. It was cold, but the cold was inside walls she hadn't paid for, and the stove in the kitchen was banked low and would hold until morning, and tomorrow she'd have proper supplies and she could do the job she'd been hired to do, and tonight that was enough. She closed her eyes. Outside, the temperature dropped another 10 degrees, and somewhere north of the ridge, a proper blizzard was gathering itself, getting ready, taking its time. It didn't know what it was coming toward. The second week at Boone Ridge was harder than the first, in the specific way that second weeks always are. The novelty had worn off and the reality had set in, and the reality was that 14 men with strong opinions and limited social refinement were not going to adjust their behavior based on one good meal. Jude Calloway was the one she had to watch. Emmett Harrow had his cruelties, but they were blunt, easy to read, the kind of meanness that came from a man who'd never had to develop subtlety because size and volume had always been sufficient. Jude was different. He was the type who waited until her back was turned, who said things just below the threshold of what could be formally addressed, who had a gift for the comment that sounded almost like a compliment until you thought about it later and realized what he'd actually said. The morning of the 9th day, she'd come in from the cold root storage with her arms full of dried corn and found him leaning in the kitchen doorway, watching her with that loose, idle quality he carried everywhere. "You know," he said, "I was thinking, we haven't had a cook this dedicated since old Harris. Course, Harris was about 60 and had nowhere else to go either." He smiled at her. It was a perfectly pleasant smile. Rosalie set the corn on the counter. "Breakfast in 20 minutes, she said. "No offense meant," he said, still smiling. "None registered," she said, and turned her back to him and started working. She heard him leave. She kept her face arranged carefully until the sound of his boots faded, and then she allowed herself 30 seconds of pressing both palms flat on the counter and breathing through her nose, and then she was done with it, and she started the eggs. The thing she hadn't expected about the ranch, the thing that made the Jude Calloway problem bearable in a way it might not have been elsewhere, was Cal. The young man who'd driven her wagon that first day had attached himself to her kitchen with the uncomplicated loyalty of a stray dog that had been fed once and decided the matter was settled. He showed up most mornings 20 minutes before the other men, ostensibly to carry water from the pump, actually to linger near the stove where it was warm and talk. He talked about everything: his family in Missouri, the horses he liked best, which of the other hands he thought were decent, and which ones had problems he'd describe with the careful diplomacy of someone who wanted to be fair, but also wanted her to understand the situation fully. "Jude's not actually mean," Cal told her one morning in the third week while she was working biscuit dough. He gets like that when he's nervous. Makes everybody smaller so he's not the smallest." Rosalie said. "Emmett's actually worse at first, but he gets over himself faster. He already got over himself." This was true. Emmett Harrow had shifted in a direction she hadn't anticipated, not toward warmth exactly, but toward a kind of gruff acknowledgement that she was doing her job and he was eating the results of it, and those two facts existed in relation to each other. He'd started leaving his plate on the counter after meals without being asked. Last Thursday, he'd brought in a split cord of wood without comment and stacked it near the kitchen door where she could reach it easily. When she'd mentioned it to Thaddeus, he'd said he hadn't asked Emmett to do it. She'd thought about that for a while. What she'd learned in 3 weeks was that the men of Boone Ridge were not cruel the way she'd feared. They were crude and thoughtless and occasionally mean-spirited, but mostly they were just tired. They worked hard and got cold and ached in their joints and missed their families or had no families to miss. And they came in at the end of the day wanting something that made the effort feel worthwhile. She'd understood, when Thaddeus said it on the road, what he meant about making men feel like they had something to come in from the cold for. She hadn't understood then quite how literal he was being. She began making small things, not additions to the menu. There was still only so much the supply budget allowed, but details. She learned which men liked their coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, and which ones drank it weak. Old Pete, the oldest hand on the ranch, had bad teeth and couldn't eat anything hard, so she adjusted. Softer bread, beans cooked longer, eggs scrambled until they were almost custard. He never said a word about it, and she never said a word to him about noticing, but he started saying good evening to her when he came in, the way a man says it when he means more than the 2 words. She learned that Hector, a quiet man from New Mexico who spoke limited English and mostly communicated through a series of nods that varied enough in quality to form a whole vocabulary, would eat anything she put in front of him without complaint, but that his face did something specific when she put out the chili she'd started making on Fridays, a recipe that was half his mother's and half hers, worked out through a week of iteration. And that specific thing his face did was the closest thing to joy she'd seen from him. These were small things. They were also, she understood, the entire job. Thaddeus Boone was harder to read than any of them. He ate her food. He paid her on time. The $4 on the last day of that first month handed over with the same counted precision as the first 8 on the road. He answered questions when she had them and asked few himself. He came into the kitchen occasionally in the evenings, never long, never in a way that suggested he was there for company, to look at the supply list or discuss the week's schedule, or once to ask if she knew anything about treating a burn after young Cal had caught his hand on a hot poker. She'd cleaned and dressed it efficiently and told Cal that if he did it again, she'd let him suffer, which was a lie, but was the right thing to say because it made him laugh and relaxed him enough to stop flexing the hand. Thaddeus had watched this interaction from the doorway with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. "You're good with them," he said afterward, when Cal had gone. "I've got brothers back home," she said, which wasn't quite true. She had one brother, 4 years gone to California, who wrote her twice a year, but was true enough in spirit. Thaddeus nodded and went back to the main house. The distance he maintained was consistent, and she didn't push against it. She understood that she was an employee, and that there were clear lines around what that meant, and she was not a woman given to imagining things that weren't there. She'd had enough disappointments in that direction to know better. She focused on the work, and the work was good. and that was more than she'd had before. What she noticed, because she noticed things even when she was trying not to, was that he ate more than he had before she'd arrived. Cal, who tracked everything on the ranch with the obsessive attention of someone who would eventually make a good foreman if he lived long enough, mentioned it casually one afternoon. Boss used to just eat enough to keep going, you know? Like it was medicine. He shrugged. Now he eats like a person. Rosalie didn't say anything to that. But she did, the following Tuesday, make the pot roast she'd been holding back because the recipe required a full day and careful timing, and she hadn't felt settled enough to commit to it. She started it the night before, slow-cooked it through the morning, and served it at dinner with root vegetables and the good gravy. The table went quiet when she brought it out. Not the uncomfortable quiet of before, but the kind of quiet that descends when something smells so good that conversation temporarily loses its appeal. Emmett Harrow looked at his plate and then looked up at her with an expression that was, for Emmett, practically sentimental. "My mother made something like this," he said. "I know," she said, because he'd mentioned his mother once in passing, and she'd filed it away without realizing she was doing it. "The recipe's pretty close to the traditional way." He looked at his plate again and didn't say anything else. He ate 3 full servings. Jude Calloway didn't make any comments at all that night. The blizzard that had been gathering north of the ridge finally arrived in the second week of February, which was late enough that everyone had started to think it wasn't coming, and therefore early enough to catch people unprepared. It arrived overnight, fast and serious. By morning, the yard was under 2 feet of snow, and the wind was coming off the ridge with a force that made the barn door impossible to open from the outside. Rosalie had been up since 3, because she'd felt the pressure change in the air the day before and had made decisions accordingly. She'd brought extra water inside. She'd moved the root vegetables from the cold storage to the pantry. She'd checked the firewood situation and found it adequate but not generous, so she'd moved additional logs inside before dark. By the time the men staggered in for breakfast through the connecting passage from the bunkhouse, nobody was going outside in this if they could help it. She had hot oatmeal, eggs, and coffee waiting, and the kitchen was the warmest room in the main building by a significant margin. The storm raged through that day and into the next. On the first day, it was almost festive in the way severe weather sometimes is when you're inside and warm. The men played cards. Someone produced a harmonica. There was a long argument about the best way to break a horse that Rosalie listened to from the kitchen with a detachment that she found soothing. She cooked 3 meals and kept the coffee hot and didn't complain about the extra work. The second day was less festive. By mid-morning, someone had noticed that Danny Price was missing. Danny was the youngest hand on the ranch, 17 years old, with the kind of face that still carried the softness of childhood and a habit of taking on extra work to prove he deserved his place. He'd gone out the previous afternoon to check on the horses in the far paddock, a task he'd done 100 times, and that, under normal conditions, took 20 minutes. In the chaos of the storm arriving and everyone getting inside, nobody had thought to check whether he'd come back. Rosalie was in the kitchen when she heard the voices change. The particular change that moves through a group of men when something has gone wrong and they're figuring out how wrong. She came to the doorway. Thaddeus was already moving, pulling on his heaviest coat, his face set. "How long has he been out there?" she said. "Best guess, 14 hours, said Emmett. His joking quality had evaporated entirely. He looked like a different man. "In this cold, that long outside." He didn't finish it. "The far paddock is north-northeast," Thaddeus said. He was talking to the men, but his eyes swept the room in the way of someone accounting for all the variables. "Wind's mostly from the northwest, so if he moved with the wind trying to get back, he'd have drifted." "Southeast," Rosalie said. "There's a stand of cottonwoods about a quarter-mile southeast of the paddock. You can't see them in this, but they're there. If he was trying to stay warm and get out of the wind..." Thaddeus looked at her. "How do you know about those trees?" "I walked the property the first week," she said. "I wanted to know where things were." He held her look for a moment. Then he looked back at the men. "Southeast. We go in pairs and we rope together. Cal, Emmett, with me. Hector, you stay..." "I'm coming," Rosalie said. The room got very still. "You're not," Thaddeus said. "I know where those trees are, and I've been out in worse," she said, which was not entirely true, but was true enough. "You need every person who knows this land and can move. That's me." "Rosalie..." "He's 17 years old," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. I'm not standing in the kitchen while a boy freezes to death because you don't think I can walk in the snow. Thaddeus looked at her for a long moment. His jaw moved. Then he turned and grabbed a second rope from the hook by the door and held it out to her. You stay roped to me, he said. You fall. You call out. You don't try to be brave about it. Understood, she said. She was wearing her second apron. She took it off, put on her coat, her heaviest scarf, her gloves. Her hands were shaking slightly from something that wasn't entirely cold. She didn't let it show. They went out into the white. It was worse than she'd expected, and she'd expected it to be very bad. The wind was a physical force, not the kind of cold that you could brace yourself against, but the kind that simply moved through whatever you'd put between yourself and it. The snow was driven horizontal. Visibility was perhaps 20 feet in the better moments and considerably less in the worse ones. She kept the rope between herself and Thaddeus taut and moved. He found the southeast direction by something she couldn't entirely explain, some combination of reading the wind and terrain and long familiarity with the land, and she followed. Cal and Emmett moved parallel, 20 feet to their left. She could see them only intermittently. She was thinking about the cottonwoods. She'd walked to them in November, curious about the property, when the snow was light and the sky was clear and walking was just walking. She tried to hold the memory of that distance in her body, the ground sloping slightly downward, then leveling, then a rise before the trees. She was looking for the rise. She almost walked into it. The ground came up under her foot at the wrong moment, and she stumbled and pulled up on the rope, and Thaddeus turned instantly. I've got it, she said before he could ask. The trees are just ahead, 30 feet maybe. She couldn't see them, but the ground was right. The slope was right. She was right. They came out of the white blur 20 feet later. The cottonwoods, their bare branches rattling, their wide trunks breaking the worst of the wind. And there, at the base of the largest tree, curled with his knees drawn up and his coat pulled over his face, was Danny Price. He was alive. Barely and badly cold, but alive. She could see his shoulders moving with the effort of breathing, and when Emmett grabbed him and shook him, he made a sound. Thaddeus carried him back. The whole way, over the terrain she'd just learned again in a blizzard, through the wind that tore at everything, he carried the boy without stopping, and Rosalie walked ahead of him because she knew the way, and he needed her to, and she kept her head down and moved. They got Danny inside, and she took over from there. She'd seen frostbite before. Her father had lost 2 fingers on his right hand to it, years ago, and she remembered the process her mother had used with the calm specificity of a child who had watched carefully, because watching carefully was how she'd learned most things. She put Danny in the warmest room, got him out of the wet clothes, wrapped him in every blanket in the house, while the men crowded the doorway uselessly. Warm water, not hot, she told Cal, who was the most useful of the hovering group. And get the kitchen fire as high as it'll go. I need broth on, beef broth if there's the bones for it, and she worked through the afternoon. Danny's fingers and toes were bad but not catastrophic. He'd be sore and he'd be scared for a few days, and he'd probably keep all his digits, which was more than she'd been sure of when they'd carried him in. At some point in the early evening, she became aware that the kitchen had gotten quiet in a specific way, and she looked up from where she was standing at the stove to find Thaddeus in the doorway. He'd been there for a while, she thought. He had the look of someone who'd been watching long enough to stop being self-conscious about it. He's going to be all right, she said. I know, he said. You've been going for 12 hours. She looked at her hands. They were a little unsteady with fatigue, she noticed, now that she was paying attention. I'll be fine, she said. The broth's done, he said. I can take it into him. She looked at him. In the kitchen light, with his coat off and the tension of the rescue behind them both, he looked different from the man on the road. Still hard-faced, still contained, but the containment seemed less like coldness now and more like the way a man holds himself when he's carrying something heavy and has been for a long time. All right, she said. She let him take the broth. She sat down on the stool in the corner. Her feet hurt. Her shoulders hurt. She was warm, finally, in the core of her body where the cold had been sitting all afternoon. Outside, the blizzard was still going, but she could tell from the sound that it was beginning to ease. The wind had dropped from a roar to a sustained moan, and the moan had started to develop gaps. Cal came in a while later and said Danny had eaten half the broth and was asking about his horse. which everyone took as a sign that he was going to be fine. Rosalie put her head back against the wall and closed her eyes. She heard Thaddeus come back into the kitchen. She heard him move and the sound of a cup being filled, and then he set something down on the small table next to her stool. She opened her eyes. It was coffee, and beside it, a piece of the cornbread left from dinner, and it had been placed there by the man who owned the ranch, quietly, without ceremony, while she sat with her eyes closed and her feet aching after a day she would not forget. She looked at the coffee. She looked at the doorway where he'd already half turned to go back to the main house. "Mr. Boone," she said. He paused. "Thank you," she said. He stood there for a moment in the doorway with his back mostly to her, and he said, "Get some rest, Rosalie," in a voice that was quieter than his usual speaking voice, rougher at the edges. Then he went through the door. She drank her coffee. She ate the cornbread. The storm outside dropped by another degree of intensity, the wind coming in lower and slower now, and the kitchen settled around her with its familiar smells of wood smoke and grease and the last of the broth. And she sat there for a while in the warm room she'd made warm, in the life she was slowly making something of, and let herself feel, not happiness, exactly, not yet, but the solid and unambiguous awareness that she was somewhere she was wanted. Not perfectly, not without difficulty, but wanted. That was more than she'd had for a very long time. Spring came to Boone Ridge the way it always did in that part of the territory. Not all at once, but in arguments. A warm week in March that softened the ground and made everyone believe the worst was over, followed by a hard freeze that killed 2 of the early wildflowers and cracked the water trough in the east paddock. Then genuine warmth in April, slow and real, the kind that stayed in the soil overnight and let you trust it. Rosalie noticed it in the kitchen first, the way the morning light changed, coming in lower and longer through the east window, landing on the flour-dusted counter in a way that made even the ordinary work of early morning look like something worth seeing. She'd been at Boone Ridge 4 months. The counting had become unconscious, the way you count things that matter without meaning to. Danny Price had recovered fully, which everyone already knew, but which became official the morning he showed up for breakfast with color back in his face and an appetite that suggested he was making up for lost time. He'd eaten 4 biscuits before anyone else had finished their first, and seemed unaware of it. The men around the table had watched him with the particular affection that people develop for someone they've been frightened of losing. He found Rosalie after breakfast when she was washing up. He stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands and the specific awkwardness of a young man attempting formality. "I wanted to say something," he said. "You don't have to," she said. "I know, but I want to." He looked at his hat. "My ma is back in Kansas. She doesn't know what happened. I didn't write her about it because, well, I didn't want to scare her, but I thought about her a lot when I was out there." He paused. "You reminded me of her some. The way you worked, the way you didn't panic." He looked up. "So, thank you." Rosalie looked at him for a moment. 17 years old with big, cold, reddened hands and a face that had no idea yet what it was going to become. "Write your mother," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and put his hat back on and left. She turned back to the dishes and stood there for a minute before she actually started washing them. The shift at the ranch was subtle enough that she might have missed it if she hadn't been paying attention, and she was always paying attention. It was in the small things first. The way the men said good morning now, not as a formality but as something they actually meant, or most of them did. The way Emmett Harrow had begun, without discussion or announcement, to handle the heaviest supply deliveries so she didn't have to, hauling flour sacks and salt pork from the wagon with the same wordless competence he brought to everything. The way Hector, whose English remained limited and whose communication still ran mostly on nods, had taken to leaving small things on the kitchen windowsill. A smooth stone once, a handful of early wildflowers in April, once a small carving of a horse that he'd made himself from a piece of wood and that Rosalie put on the shelf above the range where she could see it while she worked. Jude Calloway remained the exception, but even Jude had quieted. He still carried his lazy, half-insolent quality through every room he entered, but the comments had tapered off, partly, she suspected, because nobody laughed at them anymore, and Jude's particular variety of cruelty required an audience to function. What she hadn't expected was to miss the cabin. She'd expected to feel relieved, and she did feel relieved, Every cold morning when she didn't have to nurse a fire back from near dead. Every payday when there was actual money rather than the thin trickle of bread and pie money she'd been surviving on. But she missed the silence. At the ranch, there was always sound. Boots on floors, men's voices, horses, wind through the gaps in the barn boards. At the cabin, the silence had been her own. Here, she shared the air with 14 other people's lives, and some mornings that weight pressed on her in ways she couldn't quite explain to herself. She managed it the way she managed most things. She got up earlier, 30 minutes before she needed to start breakfast, while the ranch was still dark and the only sounds were distant cattle and the fire she was building. She had the kitchen to herself. She drank her coffee standing at the east window and watched the light change and didn't think about anything in particular. And by the time she needed to start thinking again, she had enough of herself back to do it properly. Thaddeus found her there one morning in late April. She hadn't heard him come in. The man moved quietly for his size, and she registered his presence when he stopped in the doorway and said, "You're always up before the fire's properly going." "The fire's properly going," she said, without turning. "I just like the window." He came into the kitchen and poured himself coffee from the pot she'd made and stood at the opposite end of the counter in a way that was not close but was closer than the professional distance he usually maintained. He looked at the window too. "What are you looking at?" he said. "The light," she said. "The way it comes up. It's different every morning." He didn't say anything to that. She'd expected him not to. He was not a man who performed appreciation for observations. But he stood there with his coffee and looked at the window with her, and they spent perhaps 5 minutes like that without speaking, which was a new thing, not uncomfortable, just new. "I need to go to Blackthorn Crossing today," he said eventually. "Supply run. You need anything specific?" She had a list already, as she always did. She passed it to him. He folded it into his coat pocket without looking at it, which she'd come to understand was his way of indicating he'd take it seriously. He left. She started the biscuits. That evening, he came back from town with everything on her list and an additional item he set on the kitchen counter without comment. A small tin of cinnamon, good quality, the kind that cost more than the generic variety the dry goods store stocked. She hadn't put it on the list because it wasn't a necessity. She looked at it. She looked at him. He was already moving toward the main house door. "I notice you use it," he said, not quite stopping. "When you have it." Then he was gone. She stood there with the tin of cinnamon in her hands and told herself firmly that this meant nothing beyond an employer who paid attention to his operation. That was all. She was very firm about it. She made cinnamon rolls the next morning. Vivienne Hale arrived on a Wednesday in early May, which was, Rosalie would later think, exactly the wrong time. Not that there would have been a right time, but Wednesday was wash day, and Rosalie had been on her feet since before dawn, and her hair had come half down from its braid, and there was flour on her second-best apron in 3 different places, which was the apron she was wearing because her best one was hanging on the line. The sound of the carriage was the first indication. Rosalie heard it from the kitchen and didn't think much of it. Supply deliveries came by wagon sometimes, and there was a farrier expected sometime this week. She was halfway through a pie crust when she heard the voices from the yard change in a specific way, the way men's voices change when a woman appears among them, and she straightened and looked out the window. The carriage was black with yellow trim and was pulled by 2 matched bays that someone had spent money on. The woman climbing down from it had dark hair piled in an arrangement that was not practical for travel and was therefore a statement about what she could afford to be impractical about. She wore a green traveling coat that fit her extremely well. She was by any standard that Blackthorn Crossing or any of the surrounding territory would apply to such assessments, extraordinarily beautiful. The fine-boned, symmetrical kind of beautiful that operates like a natural force and is fully aware of the fact. Rosalie did not know who she was yet. She knew, in the way she always knew things, what the situation was. Cal came into the kitchen 30 seconds later with the expression of someone delivering news they're not sure how to categorize. "Someone's here," he said. "I can see that." "Vivienne Hale." He said the name the way you say the name of a weather pattern. "From over in Carlisle County. She and the boss." He stopped. "They used to be. I think they were." He stopped again. "I understand," Rosalie said. "She comes through about once a year," Cal said. "Usually doesn't stay long." Rosalie looked at the pie crust. She pressed it flat with the heel of her hand, firmly.
Then I'd better make sure there's enough food for a guest, she said.
She met Vivian Hale formally an hour later when Thaddeus brought her through the house for reasons that seemed unclear and might have been intended as courtesy or might have been something else. Vivian walked into the kitchen the way women like Vivian walk into most rooms, with the awareness of a person accustomed to being the most significant object in any space she entered. Her eyes went to Rosalie with the quick, precise assessment of a woman who has been cataloging other women since childhood. The assessment took perhaps 2 seconds, and Rosalie felt every one of them. "This is Rosalie Whitaker," Thaddeus said. "She runs the kitchen."
"How wonderful," Vivian said. She had a voice like expensive fabric, smooth, a little cool, pleasant to the surface. Thaddeus has always needed someone reliable in the kitchen. He hasn't the patience for it himself. She smiled at Rosalie. It was a perfectly constructed smile. "It smells lovely in here." "Thank you," Rosalie said. "What are you making?" "Apple pie and a roast for dinner." "Apple pie." Vivian's smile didn't change. "How homey."
She said it the way you might describe a child's drawing, warmly, with the specific warmth of someone communicating that the thing being described is charming in its way, but not something an adult would take seriously. Rosalie kept her hands moving on the pastry. Thaddeus, she noticed, was looking at a point on the wall slightly above and to the left of both women, which was the look of a man who had been in this situation before and had not found a way to make it comfortable.
"I'll have dinner ready at 6, Rosalie said, looking at him rather than Vivian. "If your guest has any preferences—" "Oh, don't change a thing on my account," Vivian said. "I'm sure whatever you make for the workers will be perfectly fine." The kitchen was very quiet for a moment.
6 o'clock, Thaddeus said to Rosalie, and his voice had a tightness in it that might have been apology or might have been warning. Then he gestured for Vivian to precede him back through the door, and they left. Rosalie stood at the counter. She pressed the heel of her hand into the pastry and rolled it flat and told herself it didn't matter. She'd been called worse than a worker. She was a worker. There was nothing wrong with being a worker. She made the pie. She made the roast. She made it all as well as she made everything. Because the only response she'd ever found that was worth making to people like Vivian Hale was to be so thoroughly competent that the contempt had nothing to stick to. But her hands weren't quite steady while she did it, and she knew why, and she didn't allow herself to think too carefully about why. What?
Vivian stayed 3 days. The first day was tolerable because Rosalie was busy and Vivian was occupied with Thaddeus. She could see them from the kitchen window sometimes, walking the property, or sitting on the porch in the afternoon when the air warmed up. Vivian laughed often and loudly, the kind of laugh designed to be heard. Rosalie noted that Thaddeus didn't laugh back, not that she could hear, but he also didn't cut the visit short, not that she could see.
The second day was worse. Vivian came into the kitchen mid-morning while Rosalie was doing inventory, which was the kind of domestic, ordinary work that felt particularly exposed when someone like Vivian was observing it. Vivian sat down at the kitchen table uninvited and watched with the breezy interest of someone watching a zoo exhibit. "You've really made this your domain, haven't you?" Vivian said. It was not precisely a question. "I try to keep it organized," Rosalie said. "Thaddeus says you've been here since December." She ran one finger along the edge of the table, not checking for dust, just touching. "That's a long time for a cook to last here. He's very particular." "I know," Rosalie said. "The men seem fond of you." She said it with the same gentle condescension she'd applied to the apple pie. "That's quite an achievement. Cowboys are not generally a refined audience." Rosalie counted the salt sacks and wrote the number down. "But then," Vivian continued, and her voice shifted almost imperceptibly, "I suppose everyone has their place, don't they? Some women run households. Some women run kitchens." She smiled again. "It's good that you found yours." Rosalie put down her pencil. She turned around and looked at Vivian Hale directly. "Is there something you'd like for lunch?" she said. The smile stayed on. "Whatever's easiest." "Then I'll let you know when it's ready," Rosalie said, and picked up her pencil again. Vivian left the kitchen shortly after, but the feeling she left behind was the kind that doesn't go away when a person leaves the room. It settles into the walls and the air and waits there. Rosalie knew it well. She'd grown up with it. The particular way women like Vivian communicated to women like Rosalie that the whole arrangement of the world was already decided and everyone should be comfortable in their correct position. She'd spent her whole life being told her position. She'd spent 11 years in a small cabin turning that position into something she could stand on. And here she was standing on it, and she was fine, and Vivian Hale's opinion of apple pie and kitchen work didn't mean anything. She stood at the counter and rolled the pastry for a second pie and told herself that. She almost believed it. The third day was when everything came apart. Rosalie was carrying a full tray across the yard from the cookhouse to the main house, an unnecessary detour that the layout of the ranch occasionally required, when she heard Vivian's voice from the porch. Vivian was speaking to two of the hands, Emmett and one of the others, in the casual way of a woman confident of her audience. Rosalie slowed without meaning to. Thaddeus has always had a soft spot for strays, Vivian was saying. Her voice was pleasant. It was still a pleasant voice. It's one of his more endearing qualities. A lame horse, a lost dog. She paused, and the pause was very precisely timed. Well, a woman nobody else wanted. Rosalie stopped walking. She heard Emmett's voice, low and uncomfortable, saying something she couldn't make out. Not laughing, which she registered somewhere in the back of her mind, but that was not the part of her mind that was currently in charge. "Oh, don't misunderstand me," Vivian continued, and her voice had a laughing quality to it, warm and amused, talking to the men the way you talk to people you know will enjoy the joke. "I'm sure she's perfectly capable in the kitchen, and it must be such a relief for her. A woman like that, finding somewhere she's needed, somewhere she fits." Another pause. "Even if it is just the kitchen." Rosalie stood in the yard with the tray in her hands. She'd been here before. Not this exact yard, not this exact woman, but this exact moment. The one where she stood in a group of people and heard herself described as the punchline of a joke about what kind of woman she was, and felt the thing inside her that she'd spent years learning to hold still begin to pull at its moorings. She kept walking to the main house. She set the tray down. She went back to the kitchen. She stood at the kitchen counter and did not cry, because she hadn't cried over something like this in a long time, and she wasn't going to start now. She stood there and breathed slowly and looked at the east window and the afternoon light coming through it. By dinner, she had decided. She'd stay through the week. She wouldn't leave Thaddeus without a cook without reasonable notice, and the men had nothing to do with Vivian Hale. She'd see Vivian off the property, and then she'd speak to Thaddeus about a transition, and she'd go back to the cabin or somewhere else, and she'd start again. She'd started again before. She brought dinner out at 6. She served it competently. She did not look at Vivian, and she did not look at Thaddeus, and she cleared the table at the end with the same steady hands she'd brought to everything for 5 months. She was almost back to the kitchen when she heard the chair move. "Rosalie?" Thaddeus's voice. She stopped but didn't turn. "A moment," he said. She heard Vivian say something, a light, dismissive syllable. And Thaddeus's voice came back, and she couldn't hear what he said, but she could hear the tone of it. It was the same tone he used when he told the ranch hands a thing that was not up for discussion. Then boots on the floor, and Vivian's cooler footsteps, and the sound of someone going upstairs. Rosalie turned. Thaddeus was standing by the table. The other men had gone. She hadn't noticed when the dining room had quietly emptied. He looked at her across the length of the room, and he had the expression she'd seen on him the night of the blizzard, when he'd carried Danny Price across the snow. "What did she say to you?" he said. "Nothing I haven't heard before," Rosalie said, and she meant it matter-of-factly. It was true. "That's not an answer." "Mr. Boone, Thaddeus," he said. "We've been past Mr. for a while." She looked at him. She'd been careful with this. She'd been careful with all of it, all the small, careful boundaries she'd built around what she let herself see and what she let herself want and what she allowed herself to understand about the particular quality of the air in the kitchen at 5 in the morning when it was just the two of them and the window and the light changing. "I'm going to give you my notice," she said. "At the end of the week." He didn't move. "Why?" "Because it's easier," she said. She hated herself slightly for how true it was. "Easier than what?" he said. She didn't answer that. She turned to go back to the kitchen. "She doesn't speak for me," Thaddeus said. His voice was level, but it had something under it. Whatever she said or implied. "She doesn't speak for me. She never did. Rosalie stopped in the doorway. "There's something I want you to hear," he said, "and I want you to hear it clearly. Not—" He stopped and started again, and she realized she'd never heard him stop and start before. He was a man who said things once. Not the way people have said things to you that you've had to find a way to live with. "I want to say it plainly." She turned back to look at him. He wasn't performing. That was what she registered first and most powerfully. There was nothing in his face that was constructed for effect. No softness put on for the occasion, no warm expression assembled because the situation called for it. Just Thaddeus Boone standing in his own dining room looking at her with the same directness he brought to every other thing he said. "You're not a stray," he said. "You're not here because nobody else wanted you. You're here because I chose you, because you are the best thing that has happened to this ranch in 10 years, and if you don't know that, then I have not been clear enough." Rosalie stood very still. "I'm not good at—" He stopped, made a short, frustrated sound. "I'm aware I'm not easy to work for, or be around. The men would tell you." He looked at the table, then back at her. "But I know what this place was before December, and I know what it is now, and the difference is you. Not the food, not the—" He shook his head. "You. The way you see people. The way you take care of them without making them feel small for needing it. I've watched you with 14 men who didn't deserve the first meal you made them, and I have watched you make every single one of them feel like they matter, every single day, without complaint." His voice had gone quiet. Not soft. Thaddeus Boone did not do soft, but quiet and real. "Vivian Hale thinks people have correct positions in the world," he said. "I don't, and I won't have her in this house telling you what yours is." The kitchen clock counted out several seconds. "What are you saying?" Rosalie said, and her voice came out careful and flat because she was holding it that way. "I'm saying don't give your notice," he said. "I'm saying—" He stopped again, looked at her with something in his expression that was new and that she recognized even though she'd told herself not to. "I'm saying I'd like the chance to be clearer. About things." Outside, one of the horses in the barn called out, high and sharp, and was answered by another. Rosalie looked at Thaddeus Boone. She looked at the man who'd tasted her bread on a frozen road and spoken to her like an adult, who'd given her a job and a kitchen and 8 silver dollars counted out in advance, who'd handed her a rope in a blizzard without making a speech about it, who'd left cinnamon on the counter and said simply, "I notice you use it." She was afraid. That was the honest truth of it. She was afraid in the specific way you're afraid when something you've stopped letting yourself want appears to be against all evidence and experience actually possible. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "All right," she said again. And this time it wasn't tentative. She went into the kitchen. She washed the last of the dinner dishes and put them away and scrubbed the counter and banked the fire for the night. She heard, at some point, Vivian's footsteps overhead and the muffled sound of a conversation through the ceiling that she didn't try to make out. An hour later, she heard the creak of the porch stairs and looked out the kitchen window to see Vivian Hale, in her traveling coat, getting into her carriage. The driver clicked at the match bays and the carriage moved out of the yard and down the road in the dark. Cal appeared at the kitchen door a few minutes later. "She left," he said, with the poorly suppressed satisfaction of someone delivering good news. "I know," Rosalie said. "Just thought you should know." "Thank you, Cal." He lingered. "You all right?" She thought about that for a moment, honestly, the way she tried to think about most things. "Yes," she said. "I think I actually am." He nodded, satisfied, and went back to the bunkhouse. Rosalie stood in the kitchen alone. The fire was low and steady. The spring night was cool but not cold, nothing like December cold, the kind that lived in your bones. She could hear the cattle in the distant field and the wind through the new leaves on the cottonwoods. She had not been chosen before. Not openly, not without asterisks or apology or the specific hesitance of someone doing what they considered a generous thing. She had been tolerated and occasionally appreciated and frequently overlooked, and once, briefly, at 23, courted by a man who had eventually chosen someone smaller and lighter and easier to explain to his mother. This was different. She didn't know yet what it was exactly, or what it would become, or whether it would become anything at all. She was not a woman who built elaborate futures out of single conversations, but she knew the difference between being managed and being seen, and she knew which one had just happened. She turned out the kitchen lamp and went to her room and lay down in the dark and listened to the spring sounds of the ranch and let herself feel for the first time in a very long time something she didn't immediately reach for a reason to distrust. The days after Vivian left had a different quality to them. Not easier exactly, but cleaner, like a room after a window has been opened.
Rosalie noticed it in small ways.
The morning silences in the kitchen had changed. When Thaddeus came in for his early coffee now, he stayed longer than he used to. Not dramatically longer, not in any way that would have been obvious to someone tracking minutes, but she tracked it. 10 minutes had become 20. The window conversation, which had started as a single morning, had become a quiet habit neither of them had formally agreed to. He didn't say much during these mornings. That was fine. He wasn't a man who filled silence out of discomfort, and she'd learned to read the difference between silence that was closed and silence that was simply how he occupied space. These mornings were the second kind. He told her things, occasionally, in the spare way he had, about the ranch, mostly, the east pasture fence that needed replacing before summer, a dispute with a neighboring outfit over water rights that had been simmering for 2 years and showed no sign of resolving, the fact that the cattle numbers were better this spring than they'd been in 3 years, which he said without satisfaction, the way people state facts they're still in the process of trusting. She told him things back, about the supply costs, which she tracked carefully and had reduced by 12% through better planning, about old Pete's teeth, which were getting worse and which she thought someone should address before the man was down to nothing but broth, about the recipe she was trying to develop for a traveling pie, something that would hold for days without going bad, useful for the men who sometimes worked the far pastures for a week at a stretch. One morning he said, "You're not a cook." She looked at him. I mean, he made the small, frustrated gesture she'd come to recognize as his version of backtracking. "You cook. You're the best cook I've ever employed, but that's not what you are." "What am I then?" she said. He looked at the window for a moment. "Someone who runs things," he said, quietly, without making a fuss about it. The kind of person a place needs to function. She didn't know what to say to that, so she refilled his coffee and didn't say anything. But she thought about it for the rest of the day, the way she thought about things that landed in a place she hadn't expected. June arrived, and with it the heat, and with the heat came the illness. It started with Dix, the same Dix of the shooting contest hat story, a rangy, good-natured man in his late 20s who never seemed to take anything seriously and who was therefore one of the more reliable hands on the ranch because nothing rattled him. He missed breakfast one morning, which was unusual enough that Cal mentioned it, and by noon he was in his bunk with a fever that had climbed to a height that made the men around him visibly uneasy. By the following morning, 2 more men were down. By the end of the week, it was 7. The illness moved fast and hit hard. High fever, severe body aches, a cough that settled deep in the chest and wouldn't shift. It wasn't the kind of sickness you could push through. The men who tried to push through it ended up worse for it, which Rosalie established on the second day when she went to the bunkhouse and found 3 men who should have been in bed attempting to play cards, and made her position on this very clear. "You're going to bed," she said. "Ma'am, we're fine." "Hector, translate for me," she said. Hector, who was one of the healthy ones and had been drafted as a kind of aide, looked pained but obliged, though his English was better than he usually let on. "You're going to bed, you're going to drink the broth I bring you, and if I come back in an hour and find any of you vertical, I'm going to make your lives considerably worse than the fever already has." They went to bed. The problem was scale. 7 sick men in a bunkhouse was a nursing situation beyond the ordinary capacity of a ranch kitchen. Rosalie did the accounting quickly and without sentiment. She had a large kitchen, reasonable supplies, her own knowledge of illness remedies built from years of necessity, and she had Thaddeus and the remaining healthy hands. What she did not have was time to spare. She reorganized everything. The healthy men took over the outdoor ranch work in abbreviated form, the necessary things, the cattle and horses and fence, and took rotating shifts carrying supplies and broth to the bunkhouse. Cal, who had attached himself to Rosalie's operation with a usefulness that had grown considerably since December, became her primary runner. She drafted Danny Price, who had personal reasons to take illness seriously, for the overnight watch. Thaddeus she deployed on the things that required his authority. The supply run to town for the medicines she needed, The message to the nearest doctor 2 towns over, the management of the healthy men who had their own fears about contagion and needed someone to give them a clear structure to operate in. She didn't ask him to do any of this. She told him what needed doing and let him decide how to do it, which was how she'd learned he worked best. He didn't like being managed. He didn't mind being given a problem. The doctor's reply came back the second day. He was occupied with a similar outbreak in his own town and could not come, but he sent a list of recommendations that Rosalie read once and set aside. She already knew most of it, and the parts she didn't know aligned with what she'd been doing. The remedies she worked with were the practical kind. Strong bone broth made from the beef bones Thaddeus had gotten from the butcher in town, which she kept going in a continuous pot on the back burner and ladled out in regular intervals. Willow bark tea for the fever, which she made by the quart, and which the men drank with varying degrees of complaint. Poultices for the worst chest congestion, a technique she'd learned from a woman in Blackthorn Crossing years ago, one of the older farm wives who'd raised 7 children through every variety of frontier illness. She kept the bunkhouse aired as much as the summer heat allowed, which the sick men resisted because they wanted warmth, but which she knew mattered. She slept in fragments. 3 hours before dawn, another 2 in the afternoon when the acute nursing demands dropped slightly. She ate standing at the kitchen counter because sitting down felt like a commitment to stopping that she couldn't afford. On the 4th day, Emmett Harrow got sick. She'd known it was coming. She'd watched him slow down for 2 days, seen the particular gray quality that his skin took on, and had said nothing because Emmett's pride operated in a specific and predictable way, and saying something would have made him worse. When he came into the kitchen on the 4th morning and stood in the doorway looking like a man who had been fighting a losing battle with his own body for 48 hours and had just lost, she simply pointed at the chair. He sat down without argument. That was how she knew he was actually sick. "Don't tell the men I'm down," he said. "They'll know by tonight," she said, mixing his first dose of willow bark tea. "Not yet." He coughed hard. "Let me have the morning." She looked at him. He was gray and miserable and trying very hard to maintain something she understood, the particular dignity of a man who has been someone people rely on and is afraid of what it means to be the one who needs carrying for a while. "Drink this," she said. "I'll tell them you're doing an equipment check." He drank the tea with the expression of a man drinking something medicinal, which it was. He didn't thank her, but his shoulders dropped slightly, the rigid set of them, and she thought that was close enough. "You're going to be fine," she said. "You're strong, and you got to rest before it got too bad. The ones who went down first were already run down from the week before." She poured him a second cup. 2 days of broth and sleep, and you'll be back to making everyone's life difficult." He made a short sound that was almost a laugh. "Is that supposed to make me feel better?" he said. "It's supposed to make you drink your tea," she said. He drank his tea. Thaddeus found her on the 6th day at 2 in the morning in the kitchen. She was at the stove, which was where she was at most hours that week, checking the broth pot and making notes on a folded piece of paper she'd been keeping track of each man's symptoms and food intake on. She heard him come in and didn't turn. "Go back to bed," she said. "I was up anyway," he said. "Dix?" "Better. Fever broke an hour ago. He asked for real food, which is a good sign." "Emmett?" "Sleeping. Fever's down to manageable." She made a note. "The 2 new ones, try Garrett and Webb. They're going to be rough for another day or 2, but they both responded to the broth faster than the first group. I think we're past the worst." Thaddeus came to stand near the stove. She was aware of how close he was in the way you're aware of heat from a source. Not touching, not intrusive, just present. He looked at the pot, at the notepaper, at her hands, at the dark circles under her eyes that she knew were there without needing to see them. "When did you last sleep?" he said. "This afternoon, a couple hours." "Before that?" She had to think. "Tuesday night." "It's Friday." "I know what day it is, Thaddeus." He was quiet for a moment. "Rosalie." "I'm fine," she said. "You look like you're running on spite." "That's not inaccurate," she said. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. He reached past her and picked up the ladle and stirred the broth with the particular competence of someone who was not a cook but understood the basic mechanics of the thing, And she let him do it because her arms were tired, and there was something about standing in the kitchen at 2 in the morning and letting someone else stir the pot for a minute that felt like putting down something heavy she hadn't realized she was carrying. "Sit down," he said. "I need to check on—" "Cal's with them. I asked him to take the watch." He looked at her. "Sit down, 10 minutes. She sat down at the kitchen table. It felt different from below. The kitchen looked different from the chair, lower, the ceiling higher, the window to the outside, a dark rectangle with the night in it. Thaddeus poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her and sat across the table. "Tell me about your mother," he said. She looked at him. It was coming from him a startling sentence. "Why?" she said. "Because you've been running yourself into the ground for 6 days taking care of my men," he said. "And I'd like to know something about you that isn't about what you can do." He looked at his cup. "You know about me. The ranch, the water rights, all of it. I've talked at you every morning for 3 months. You haven't talked at me," she said. I'm not accustomed to—" He stopped. "I talk too much about the ranch." "I like hearing about the ranch," she said. He looked at her. "Tell me about your mother." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. The kitchen was warm and quiet, and the night outside was still, and she was tired enough that her defenses were running at reduced capacity. "She was a good cook," Rosalie said. "Better than me in some ways. She had a sense for spice that I've never quite matched. She could walk into a kitchen with almost nothing and make something that tasted like she'd planned it for days." She paused. "She died when I was 19. Before that, she taught me that the kitchen was the most important room in any house, because it was the room where people could always be helped. You couldn't fix everything. You couldn't make the world different. But you could feed someone, and feeding someone well is never a small thing." Thaddeus listened. He didn't fill the pause when she stopped, which was how she knew he was actually listening and not waiting for his turn. "She would have liked this kitchen," Rosalie said. "The range. She made do with a wood stove her whole life." "She sounds practical," Thaddeus said. She was. She also had no patience for self-pity. If you were sad, fine. Be sad. But you still had to chop the carrots. Rosalie almost smiled. She said feelings were allowed to exist, but they weren't allowed to stop the work. "Smart woman," he said. She was. Rosalie looked at her coffee. "I think about her when I'm doing this. When things get hard and I'm tired and it would be easier to stop. I can hear her. Chop the carrots, Rosalie." "And you chop the carrots." "I chop the carrots," she said. He nodded slowly. Something had shifted in his expression. Still his face, still the lined, weather-carved face that didn't give much away, but something behind it was different, attending in a different way. "My father built this ranch," he said. Not as a change of subject, as an offering in kind. He wasn't a kind man. He was fair, in his way, but he wasn't built for softness. He looked at his cup. "I grew up thinking that's what the land required. Hardness. No waste, no sentiment, keep moving. He died thinking he'd built something that would outlast him." "He did," Rosalie said. "Maybe." His jaw moved. "But it was empty for a long time before you got here. I don't mean the house, I mean—" He stopped, dissatisfied with whatever word he was reaching for. "I know what you mean," she said. He looked at her. "Do you?" "A place can be functioning and still be empty," she said. "I lived alone for 11 years. The cabin worked. The fire burned. I ate. But empty is different from broken. Empty is just absent." Thaddeus looked at her for a long moment across the kitchen table. "Yes," he said, "that's exactly it." They sat there for a while longer with their coffee going cold, and outside the summer night was very still, and from the bunkhouse came no sounds of alarm, and Dix's fever had broken, and Emmett was sleeping, and the broth pot breathed on the stove. At some point, Rosalie's eyes began closing of their own accord. Not gradually, but in the sudden, negotiation-free way of a body that has simply reached its limit. She was aware of it and tried to push back against it, and couldn't. She wasn't sure how much time passed. She became aware of a blanket around her shoulders, not a kitchen towel, an actual blanket from somewhere in the house, and the lamp on the table turned down low, and the sound of Thaddeus moving quietly around the kitchen, checking the stove, refilling the broth pot. She didn't open her eyes. She told herself she would in a moment. She didn't. When she woke, it was beginning to be light outside. She was at the kitchen table still, the blanket around her, her head resting on her folded arms. She was alone in the kitchen. The stove was properly banked, the broth pot covered, the cups from the night before washed and on the counter. There was a piece of paper on the table in front of her. She unfolded it, in handwriting that was direct and slightly cramped, the way a man writes who learned writing as a tool rather than a skill. Cal has the watch. Men are stable. You did enough. Sleep. That was all. She sat at the kitchen table in the early light and read it twice. Her back ached. Her feet ached. She needed a bath and a proper night's sleep and probably more food than she'd been eating. The broth on the stove needed refreshing, and she had a full day of nursing meals ahead, and she was, objectively, tired in a way that went past her bones. She folded the note and put it in her apron pocket. Then she got up and started the fire for breakfast because the men, the sick ones and the well ones both, needed feeding, and because that was the work, and because her mother had been right that the feelings didn't get to stop it. But her hands were steadier than they'd been in days, and the morning light on the counter looked the way it had in April, like something worth seeing, and she let herself hold on to that for the length of time it took the fire to catch, which was long enough. By the end of the second week, all 7 men were on their feet. Not well. Dix was still moving at about 60%, and Emmett, who had pushed himself back to work 2 days ahead of when she'd told him to, was paying for it with a cough that lingered and a fatigue he tried to hide and didn't quite manage. She let him pretend for 1 day and then put extra portions in front of him at every meal without comment, and he ate them without comment, and they didn't discuss it. The morning the last man was officially declared functional. She'd decided this herself based on observation, since the doctor still hadn't come. She walked out of the bunkhouse and found she needed to stand still for a minute. Just stand there in the summer morning air with her hands at her sides and not do anything. Cal appeared at her elbow. "They're all okay," he said, with the solemnity of someone who had been frightened for 2 weeks, and was only now letting himself believe the outcome. "They're all okay," she said. He stood next to her for a moment. Then he said, "You know, when I drove you out here in December, I thought—" He stopped. "What did you think?" "I thought it wasn't going to work," he said honestly. "I thought you'd be back in town by spring. No offense." "Some registered," she said, but not unkindly. "I was wrong," he said, simply, without ceremony. "You were," she agreed. He went back to his work. She stood in the yard a while longer. Across the property, near the main house, she could see Thaddeus talking to 2 of the hands, pointing toward the east pasture, managing the 10,000 ordinary decisions of running a ranch. He didn't look up. He didn't need to. But at some point, between one sentence and the next, he turned his head and looked directly across the yard to where she was standing. He didn't wave. She didn't wave. But he looked, and she looked back. And after a moment, he turned back to his conversation, and she turned and went back to her kitchen. She had 14 men to feed. She had a note in her apron pocket that she hadn't quite managed to throw away. She had, she thought, as she tied on her apron and looked at the east window and the particular quality of the morning light on the counter, a life that was becoming something she hadn't quite dared to plan. The note stayed in her apron pocket for 3 weeks. She told herself she'd kept it by accident the first week. She'd simply forgotten to clear her pockets before washing, and then it was there again, slightly softened from being laundered, the ink still legible, if faded. The second week, she stopped pretending it was an accident. The third week, she stopped thinking about it as a decision at all and accepted that it was just something she was doing, the way she'd accepted a lot of things about her life at Boone Ridge that she hadn't planned. Summer deepened around the ranch in the slow, relentless way of plain summers, the grass going from green to gold, the sky turning a particular shade of hard blue that had no patience for clouds. The days stretched long, and the work stretched with them. Rosalie expanded the garden behind the kitchen, which had been mostly weeds when she'd arrived and was now producing enough that she'd had to learn, rapidly, how to preserve things she'd never preserved before. She put up tomatoes and corn and a quantity of dried beans that she was quietly proud of. She started experimenting with the traveling pie, a lard crust construction sealed with egg wash that would hold for 5 days without going off, and by midsummer had a version she was satisfied with. The men ate well. The ranch ran. What had changed between her and Thaddeus since the night of the blanket and the note was something she'd have struggled to describe to anyone who asked. Nothing dramatic had happened. He hadn't declared himself or made pronouncements. But the mornings at the kitchen window had continued and deepened, and he'd started asking her opinion on ranch decisions that had nothing to do with the kitchen. The water rights dispute, whether to bring on a new hand before fall, what she thought about a fence contractor who'd given him a quote that seemed low. She answered honestly, as she always did, and he listened the way he always did, and at some point she'd stopped finding it remarkable that he asked and had started just answering. He touched her hand once, deliberately, in the kitchen in early August. She'd been cutting onions and he'd come in with a question about the supply budget, and when she'd passed him the ledger, their hands had been in the same place for a moment, and he'd let it stay that way for 2 or 3 seconds before he'd taken the ledger. It was nothing. It was also not nothing, and they both knew it, and neither of them said a word about it, and she'd gone back to her onions with her pulse beating slightly faster than onions warranted. They were moving toward something. Slowly, without rushing, the way two people move toward each other when they've both been hurt by speed before, and have decided that careful is better than fast, even if careful is harder. She thought her mother would have approved of the pace, if not of the situation itself. Her mother had been a practical woman, but not an unromantic one. She'd have said, "You can't rush the bread, and you can't rush the important things. And if someone is worth the time, they're worth the time." Rosalie was learning at 31 to believe that. Dates. The conversation that changed things arrived the way most important conversations do. Not announced, not set up, not in any of the circumstances she'd have chosen if she'd been choosing. It was a Sunday in late August, the one day of the week when the kitchen operated at reduced capacity and the men fended for themselves at midday. Rosalie had taken to walking the property on Sunday afternoons, not the structured information-gathering walks of her first weeks, but slower, purposeless ones, just the land and the light and an hour of not being needed. She'd gone out past the east pasture to the cottonwood stand. Her cottonwoods, she'd come to think of them, though she'd never have said so out loud, and was sitting on a fallen log when she heard hoofbeats and looked up to find Thaddeus on the gray gelding, moving at a walk, not appearing surprised to see her there. He dismounted and tied the horse and sat down on the log a reasonable distance from her, and they looked at the cottonwoods for a while. "I come out here sometimes," he said. "I know," she said. "I've seen the tracks." He looked sideways at her with the expression he wore when she said something that caught him off guard. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. "You notice things." "I always have," she said. They sat in the shade for a while. A woodpecker somewhere in the trees made its methodical argument with a branch. The cattle in the far field were a distant sound, low and continuous. "I want to say something," Thaddeus said, "and I want to say it right, so I'm going to take a minute." She waited. He was quiet long enough that the woodpecker finished its work and started again somewhere else. "I've run this ranch for 16 years, he said, "since my father died. 16 years of this land and these animals and the work, and I think I got too used to only accounting for myself. The work was enough, and the land was enough, and I stopped." He stopped, looked at the trees. "I stopped noticing that there was a difference between a thing that functions and a thing that's alive." Rosalie sat very still. "You said that," he said, "about empty versus broken. You said it that night in the kitchen, and I've thought about it every day since." He looked at her directly. "This ranch is alive now. The men are... You can hear it. The way they talk at dinner. The way Danny walks around like he belongs here. Even Emmett." He shook his head slightly. "Emmett Harrow brought wildflowers into the kitchen last week. I didn't know the man knew what a wildflower was." She almost laughed. "He put them in the tin cup on the windowsill." "I know, I saw." He looked at his hands. "That's you. All of it. Not just the food. The way you see people and make them feel like being seen is not a threat." He paused. "I'm not good at that. I'm aware I'm not good at that." "You're better than you think," she said. "I'm telling you what I am clearly." He had a quality when he said things directly, not blunt, but unflinching, like a man who has decided that anything worth saying is worth saying without decoration. "I am a difficult person. I am set in my ways and I don't talk enough. And when things get hard, I have a tendency to go quiet and stay there until I've worked it out alone, which is not... I understand that's not easy for people around me." No, she agreed. It's not. I'm not asking you to fix it, he said. I'm telling you it's there so you have the full information. She looked at him. Why are you giving me the full information? He held her gaze. Because I'd like you to stay. Not as the cook. He said it straightforwardly, without flourish, the way he said everything. Because the morning is different when you're in it. Because this land, I want to show it to you properly, all of it, when there's time. Because I've watched you hold this place together through things that would have broken a harder person, and I don't want to watch you do it from across a kitchen for the rest of my life. Rosalie sat on the fallen log in the cottonwood shade and let that land. She'd imagined this conversation before. Not this exact version, not his words, but the shape of it. She'd imagined it and then told herself she was being foolish, and then imagined it again and gone back and forth between wanting it and refusing to want it enough times that she'd lost count. She'd spent her whole life learning not to want things too clearly in case the clarity of the wanting made the absence worse. I'm not easy either, she said. I know. I have opinions and I state them and I don't stop working when people think I should, and I will always prioritize the people who need taking care of over schedules and plans. I know that too. And She stopped. What? He said. She looked at the trees. I spent a long time believing that a woman like me, the way I am, the way I look, that was a fixed thing, that some things simply weren't for me and I should make peace with that. She said it without self-pity, as a factual report. I made peace with it. I made a life I was proud of from what I had. And then you knocked on my door in December, and she shook her head slightly. I've been afraid to want this. I want you to know that. Not because of you, because of what it would mean if I let myself want it, and it turned out to be what I'd always been told it would be. Thaddeus was quiet for a moment. What were you told it would be? That someone like me gets close to something good, and eventually the person looks up and sees me properly and decides they made a mistake. She said it calmly because she'd lived with it long enough to say it calmly. That kindness isn't the same as choosing. He looked at her for a long moment. I chose you on a frozen road, he said. I chose you in front of Vivian Hale. I chose you every morning I walked into that kitchen when I could have taken my coffee to the study. He said it without heat, without the performance of a man trying to be convincing. Just facts, stated. I'm not a man who does things without meaning them. Ask any hand on this ranch. She looked at him. The afternoon light came through the cottonwoods in shifting pieces, and somewhere a hawk was circling, and the cattle made their low, distant sound. All right, she said, for the second time in this story, in answer to this man. And this time there was nothing tentative about it at all. He reached over and took her hand, not tentatively either, the same way he did everything, decided and present. And they sat in the cottonwood shade while the summer afternoon moved around them, and neither of them felt the need to say anything else for a while. They were married in October, on the ranch, with 14 witnesses of varying emotional sophistication. Emmett Harrow wore his good shirt, which nobody had known he owned. He shook Thaddeus's hand with the solemnity of a man conducting official business and told Rosalie, with a gruffness that was his version of tenderness, that she'd better not change a thing about the Sunday pot roast. She told him she'd consider it. He said that was good enough. Danny Price cried, which he denied immediately and continued to deny for years afterward. Cal, who had witnessed it, maintained a diplomatic silence on the subject in Danny's presence and told everyone else freely. Hector left a carved wooden spoon on the kitchen windowsill the morning of the ceremony. It was the finest thing he'd made yet. Smooth-handled, perfectly proportioned, practical. Rosalie used it every day for the rest of her life. Jude Calloway, who had been the last to come around and had done so in the grudging, incremental way of a man who'd been wrong about something and couldn't quite bring himself to say so out loud, showed up to the ceremony in a clean hat and ate 3 pieces of wedding cake and said, to no one in particular, that the cook was all right. Coming from Jude, it was practically a speech. Miss Pratt came from Blackthorn Crossing with a wrapped gift, a cookbook, slightly battered, with handwritten notes in the margins from its previous owner. She hugged Rosalie with genuine warmth and said she'd always known, and Rosalie said gently that she hadn't always known, and Miss Pratt admitted that this was true, but that she'd hoped, which she felt should count for something. The eatery was Rosalie's idea, though it took her until the following spring to say it out loud. She'd been thinking about it since winter, the travelers who passed through on the North Road, the ranch hands from neighboring outfits who sometimes stopped at Boone Ridge for water and looked at the kitchen smells coming from the main house with an expression she recognized as hunger, of the specific kind that has nothing to do with food scarcity and everything to do with food that means something. There was nothing between Blackthorn Crossing and the next town that served real food. There was an opportunity in that gap. She brought it to Thaddeus the way she'd learned to bring things to him, directly, with the practical information already assembled, not asking permission, but asking partnership. "I want to open a dining room," she said, "separate from the ranch kitchen, the old equipment shed at the east end of the property. It's the right size and the structure's sound. 6 tables, maybe 8. Lunch service for travelers, dinner on Fridays and Saturdays." Thaddeus looked at the sketch she'd drawn. Rough, functional, not artistic, just the information. "Supply cost?" he said. She told him she'd done the numbers. "Staff?" "Danny's younger sister is looking for work. He told me in his last letter. She cooks. I'd train her. Cal can handle the front of house. He's been asking for more responsibility for months." Thaddeus looked at the sketch for another moment. "What do you need from me?" "The shed, the lumber for the conversion, and about 3 months of patience while I figure out what I'm doing." He handed back the sketch. "Done," he said. That was the whole conversation. The shed took longer than 3 months to convert. It took 5, because the floor needed more work than the structure had suggested, and because Rosalie changed her mind twice about the layout before she got it right. Thaddeus did not complain about this. He hired a carpenter from Blackthorn Crossing named George, who did excellent work and talked constantly, and who after the first week had developed a strong opinion about the correct placement of the serving counter that happened to align with Rosalie's final view, which she took as confirmation. She named it simply. The sign above the door read Whittaker's. Not Boone, not Whittaker Boone, not anything more elaborate than the name she'd been born with and had carried through everything, the name that had been attached to the woman in the small cabin nobody thought much of, the name she'd decided deserved to mean something. Thaddeus had looked at the sign when George put it up and hadn't said a word about the choice of name. She'd watched him look at it. "You don't mind," she said. "It's your work," he said. "It should have your name on it." She thought about that for a long time afterward. The first Friday dinner service was not a success. This is important to say clearly because the story of Whittaker's, like the story of most things that eventually become something, did not begin with a triumph. The stove in the converted shed ran hot in a way the main house range didn't, and she hadn't fully calibrated for it, and the first 2 meat dishes came out overcooked. Danny's sister Ruth, who was 17 and capable but nervous, dropped a full pitcher of water crossing the room and stood in the resulting puddle looking like she wanted to disappear into the floorboards. Rosalie told her to get a cloth and clean it up and keep moving, and Ruth did, and nobody said anything more about it. Cal managed the front of house with earnest competence and occasional confusion about which table had ordered what, which resulted in 2 couples receiving each other's meals and being gracious enough about it. 4 tables out of 6 were filled that first night. The food, overcooked portions aside, was good. At the end of the service, one of the travelers, a weathered man in a good coat who'd said little during the meal, stopped on his way out and looked at Rosalie, who was standing near the door watching her dining room empty out. "I've eaten in the best restaurants in St. Louis," he said. "I've eaten in Denver and in Kansas City." He paused. That was better. She thanked him. He left. She stood in the doorway of her dining room looking at the 4 tables and the lamplight and the sign she could see through the window, her name on the wood, and she thought about the 11 years in the cabin and the frozen road and the 8 silver dollars in her palm, and she thought about what her mother had said about feelings not being allowed to stop the work. The feelings were allowed to exist. She let them exist, fully, for about 2 minutes in the empty dining room. Then she went back into the kitchen and started figuring out the stove. By autumn of that year, 1 full year since she'd first arrived at Boone Ridge, Whittaker's was full every Friday and Saturday, and she'd added Thursday lunch service because the demand required it. Word traveled the way word travels in territory where good things are rare and distances are long. Travelers planned their routes to pass through. A cattle drive outfit from 3 counties over made a detour specifically to eat there, which became a story that other cattle drive outfits heard and repeated. The Blackthorn Crossing Gazette, a 4-page weekly that mostly covered land disputes and the occasional livestock theft, ran a piece on the eatery in September. It called Rosalie a local woman who has established a dining establishment of notable quality. It was not effusive and it was not poetic, and she read it in the kitchen and thought about the fact that a year ago, this town had known her as the fat woman in the cabin and now called her a local woman of notable quality. And she considered what that change meant and what it cost and whether it was worth the price she'd paid for it. It was worth it. She'd paid it herself without asking anyone to subsidize her suffering, and the result was hers. That mattered. What she hadn't expected was the other thing Whitaker's became, which had nothing to do with food and everything to do with what happens when you build a place where people feel safe. Women started coming in alone, which in 1880 in a frontier town was not something that happened without reason. Young women, mostly, some from Blackthorn Crossing, some passing through, who needed a place to sit that wasn't a saloon or a church or someone else's kitchen. Rosalie didn't make a policy about it. She just made sure there was always a table and always coffee, and that nobody was made to feel their presence required justification. Ruth, who had grown from a nervous 17-year-old into someone considerably more formidable over the course of several months working for Rosalie, took it upon herself to learn the names of the regulars. She knew who was in a difficult situation and who just wanted somewhere quiet to think, and who needed someone to ask how they were without requiring a particular answer. She'd learned this from watching Rosalie, though if you'd said so to her, she'd have been embarrassed about it. Emmett Harrow, whose reinvention as a person capable of human feeling had continued at a steady pace, began stopping in on Thursday lunches. He ate alone and read a newspaper and ate too much cornbread and tipped generously, which nobody had expected. He told Cal once, when Cal mentioned noticing the regularity of the visits, that the food was good, and the coffee was strong, and it was quiet, and that was enough reason. Cal, who at this point understood almost everything about everyone on the ranch and at Whitaker's, said nothing and agreed with all 3 points. That October, the first anniversary of her arrival at Boone Ridge, though she didn't announce it because it wasn't the kind of thing you announced, Thaddeus came into the kitchen in the early morning and found her at the east window with her coffee, the way she'd been every morning for nearly a year. He poured his own coffee and stood next to her. The light was coming up over the ridge, early autumn light, lower and longer than summer, the cottonwoods beginning to turn at the edges. The yard was quiet. The horses moved in the distant paddock. Smoke started from the bunkhouse chimney. "Are you happy?" he said. She considered the question seriously, because it was a serious question and he'd asked it seriously. Happy was complicated. She was tired most days. The work was hard and the hours were long, and there were still mornings she woke with the particular specific ache of someone who spent years alone and carries that in their body even after the aloneness ends. She still had days when the old voices were louder than the current evidence. She still sometimes stood in the dining room of Whitaker's and felt, briefly, the ghost of the woman she'd been, the one who ate her own baking alone in a cold cabin and told herself it was enough. That woman hadn't been wrong to survive the way she'd survived. She'd done what was necessary with what she had, and there was nothing to be ashamed of in that. But she wasn't that woman anymore, and the distance between who she'd been and who she wasn't something she'd been given. She'd walked it herself, one cold morning at a time, one meal at a time. One decision to stay when leaving would have been easier. "Yes," she said, not in a simple way, but yes. He nodded. He looked at the window. "Good," he said. They stood there while the light came up fully, both of them with their coffee, both of them quiet, in the particular way they had of being quiet together that was its own kind of conversation. After a while she said, "I've been thinking about Sunday service." "At the eatery?" "The demand is there. Ruth can handle Saturday close if I train her properly, and Cal's ready for more responsibility." She looked at the ridge. "We could do a midday Sunday meal, simple. Family-style service, one menu, everyone eats the same thing." Thaddeus was quiet for a moment. "That'd bring in people from town." "That's the idea," she said. He considered it. "Sunday midday is slow at the ranch. I could put a hand or two to work on the eatery side if you need the help." "Emmett's going to complain that he doesn't work the dining room," she said. "Emmett Harrow has been eating at your dining room every Thursday for 4 months," Thaddeus said. "He can serve a table." She almost laughed. He'll hate it. He'll do it, Thaddeus said, with the certainty of a man who knew his people well. He'll complain about it for a week, and then he'll be the best server you have, and he'll deny that too. She did laugh then, a real one, the kind she'd learned, slowly and not without effort, to let out without checking whether it was appropriate. Thaddeus smiled, the full version of it that he kept for moments like this, and that she'd decided was one of the finest things she'd ever seen. This was the life. Not the grand version she might have written for herself at 20, not the simplified version she'd accepted at 30. This specific, imperfect, hard-working, occasionally difficult, genuinely good life. A kitchen that was hers. A man who meant what he said. 14 people who had started as strangers and become, in the complicated way that people become things to each other, something close to family. She'd spent years being told what she was. Fat girl, spinster. Nobody's first choice. The woman in the cabin. She'd carried those words the way you carry things you've been handed. Not because you asked for them, not because they were true, but because someone put them in your arms and you didn't yet know you had the right to put them down. She knew now. You don't wait for someone to come along and tell you that you're worth something. The waiting turns you into someone who exists only in relation to other people's judgments, and that's not living. That's just standing very still, hoping to eventually be noticed in the right way. You build the thing yourself. You make the meals and walk the frozen road and light the fire in the cold kitchen and do the work in front of you with the hands you have. You let people in when they deserve it, and you hold your ground when they don't, and you accept, slowly, imperfectly, without ceremony, that you are allowed to take up space in the world. Rosalie Whittaker Boone had learned this the long way, which is the only way most people learn things that matter. She turned from the window and put down her cup and tied on her apron. "I'll start the biscuits," she said. "I'll get the fire," he said. They moved through the kitchen together in the morning light. Not smoothly, not without occasionally being in each other's way, not in the perfect wordless synchrony of people in stories about happy endings. He reached past her for the wood at the same moment she stepped back, and they did a brief, awkward shuffle that neither of them was graceful about. And she said, "Watch it," and he said, "Sorry," and they both kept moving. It was ordinary. It was exactly right. Outside, Blackthorn Crossing was waking up. Somewhere down the road, the town that had once placed bets on whether she'd survive another winter alone was beginning its morning, and at the east end of Boone Ridge, the sign above the dining room door caught the first real light of day, her name in clean-cut letters against the pale wood. The smoke rose from the kitchen chimney straight up into the still autumn air, the way smoke rises when there's no wind to push it, when the morning is holding its breath before the day begins. It rose a long way before it disappeared.